Ramayana Kalpavrksam.
Third time. Jai Shri Ram. So, first of all, let me start with a vote of gratitude to Ananda ji and Anupama ji for organizing this fantastic event. I wish I were present in the first 2 days. I couldn't make it, but last night's event, specifically Dr. Vishakha Hari's performance, I think was absolutely fantastic. To strike a chord with all of us thanks to her commitment, passion and bhava. And of course, not to forget her erudition and her grasp and command over the subject. With all these stalwarts who have actually spoken on this subject, I genuinely am unsure of the organizers' wisdom of having called me to speak on such an important topic where frankly I have no institutional or formal training whatsoever. But then I'll fall back on my skills as a lawyer to faff around a bit and hopefully make sense during the course of that. Before I proceed to speak on the subject, let me first thank all those who I have benefited from in the course of my conversations to understand how to go about presenting this particular topic. Starting with my conversation with Ami Ganatra and Team Brihat. So specifically Raghav Krishna, Pankaj, Sai Priya, all of them I've benefited in my conversations with them, and of course my guru who's training me in Shad Darshanas in Sanskrit, Sri Venugopalan Shankaran, formerly from Kanchi, but currently from Shastra. So all these people have given me the ammunition I need for today. Let's see what I've made of it. Let me also perhaps give a couple of disclaimers. I'm not going to be presenting Ramayana from a motivational perspective or let's say a self-help perspective. These days, it's become a fad to talk about Ramayana and Mahabharata from the perspective of governance, leadership training, management, so on and so forth. I don't believe in it. I am not going to touch on those aspects. At the very least, I am not qualified to speak on those aspects. As someone who truly means and believes in business in terms of how to make it actionable, and from a societal perspective, I am going to try and touch upon certain macro aspects. So I am not going to cite certain verses from certain kandas and then say, look, we have been the mother of democracy for a reason. No. That is retrofitting the present onto the past. That shouldn't be done. One of the first things that I've tried to push in the course of my public discussions over the last 2 years, ever since I started working on the first book, is to push the argument that the past must be understood through the lens of the past and not through the prism of the present. Because in the process of applying presentism, the first thing that you do is you have already set the tone on the basis of which you're going to look at the past. You've started coloring your vision. It's already a tinted glass through which you look at the past. So you don't do that. So I am not going to make the mistake of saying, who is the West or the Westerner to come and teach us constitutionalism? We already knew of it through Ramayana. I am not going to make any such unsustainable statements. None of those arguments will be presented here. The occupational hazard of being a lawyer is he's always in an argumentative mode. So what I'm going to try and do during the course of the next 1.5 hours is, this is how I've split the session. I'm going to give the audience at least 40 to 45 minutes to come after me at the fag end of this session. I'm told that there are certain brilliant students who have come from Nalsar. So I hope they come after me. And I hope for their own sake that they are not woke. I can see familiar faces from the Culture team. You should see their latest calendars. I think they've done a fantastic job. I've received a couple of these complimentary calendars, and I hope you get to see them. You see, these small contributions, and small not in terms of, let's say, importance, but these are the kind of interventions that change our mind gradually. The importance of the Panchangam, the importance of the date, the importance of Tithi, so on and so forth. And Team Culture has done a fantastic job of making Sanskrit more accessible to people through games. So whenever you have an opportunity, try and take a look at all that they have to offer by way of products. I'm using this platform to showcase the work of as many people as possible, those whose experience and knowledge and erudition I've benefited from, and also who have gone all out in their pursuit of their commitment to Dharma. It's easy being a commercial litigator who straddles the commercial boat as well as the dharmic boat, because obviously my finances are not dependent on these activities. So in that sense, my bottom line is effectively shielded from any of these, let's say, the vagaries of this ecosystem. But teams and organizations like Brihat, Culture, have decided to make this not just the source of their livelihood, but they're also going ahead and engaging the society positively, in the hope that with the rising tide of dharmic consciousness, they will also benefit in a very positive and a dharmic way. That kind of commitment is something I'm still not capable of. So when I look at these people, I admire them deeply and perhaps even grudgingly to some extent. Now, coming to the topic, the first 45 to 50 minutes, I will split it in 15-minute sessions each. The first touching upon certain aspects of what I believe is applicable from Ramayana to our current day perspective, challenging certain established notions, and given who I am, also making the discussion as uncomfortable as possible. The next 15 minutes will be spent in trying to present the downfall of the European civilization based on Ramayana as an example. And the last 15 minutes will be spent showcasing perhaps a model that comes closest to the model that we wish to replicate, although there are significant ontotheological differences, showcasing the strength of their establishment as well as the weakness that the strength has now become, which is the Israeli model. All of this from a Ramayana perspective. And then finally making a case, perhaps with 5 or 6 suggestions as to what I think that the Bharatiya state must do, or rather the Indian state must do, to set the ball rolling towards a transition to a Bharatiya state. Those are perhaps the high-level points that I will be touching upon. Now, when you take a look at, let's say, Ramayana as a scripture, as someone who has no training in that, based on, I'd say, limited first-hand reading, largely second-hand consumption through conversations and through, let's say, pieces about Ramayana more than the document itself, I understand that the document has perhaps about 1100 references where dharma as a word is used. And obviously, dharma being an expansive concept is capable of multiple interpretations. So in certain instances, it takes the form of jati dharma or varnashrama dharma. In certain situations, it seems to take the form of the duty of a son to the father. So in the form of dharma in the context of interpersonal relations. And then, of course, there is the element of Rajadharma. Although this epic and this Mahakavya and this Itihasa is specifically dedicated to the journey of one particular individual, I am not interested in the bhakti element from a lawyer's perspective, because I'm looking at it primarily from the perspective of someone who's interested in understanding the contribution of Ramayana to contemporary statecraft. So I'm not going to apply the concept of bhakti when I look at it through this particular prism. And when you keep the element of bhakti outside, then the only document which I'm willing to treat as authentic source is not the secondary derivative works of Ramayana, but the primary source itself, which has to be Valmiki's contribution and not any other document. Because the first job of a lawyer is to approach any argument from the perspective of primary source and first evidence. What is the origin? What is the Gangotri? And the Gangotri has to be Valmiki Ramayana and not any other form of Ramayana. I am not demeaning the importance of bhakti or the value of all other derived forms of Ramayana. I am simply saying that the root cause, the primary cause, is the first source to be looked into when you're looking at it for objective guidance. Because the first person is primarily a narrator of what happened. And the derivative works are perhaps individual infusions of their own respective experiences and what they want to derive out of that work into the story. So if I were to look at it from this perspective, one of the importance, or let's say one of the important contributions of this figure, this historic figure, not the mythical figure, this historic figure, is his role as a Raja. It's easy to dumb down this entire conversation to Ramaraja translates to good governance. Anybody who subscribes to that particular philosophy, you will find me in the opposite camp. Do not dumb down Ramaraja to good governance. It has something much more to it than good governance. Why do I make this statement? What you see by way of the state establishment or the mold or the dhancha which keeps the state together is the product of a particular politico-theology, which is there is a certain political aspect of a theology which translates to a vision for a state. The existence of a judiciary which is unelected and which has the power to preside over the decisions of the executive and the legislature is, dare I say this without any element of exaggeration, a direct product of the relationship between the Catholic Church and the earthly power, wherein the Church prior to the Protestant reforms or the Reformation period was unanswerable, unaccountable in every way to the earthly power, because the decision of the earthly power is subject to the supervision of the spiritual power, namely the Church. That is the trigger that leads to Protestant reforms. So when someone says that the current model that Bharat employs or adopts has got nothing to do with European political theology, they are being ahistoric in their understanding of it. The concept of secularism, which translates to separation of the church from the state, surely there is a purpose for the reference to church in that particular phrase, in which case you have to certainly understand the political theology behind it. Why would secularism translate to separation between the church and the state if it had nothing to do with Christian theology in the first place or Christian political theology in the first place? Now, on a daily basis, we get to hear that the problem with Indian politics is the fact that religion and politics are constantly mixed, and that admixture is the reason for the confusion and the disharmony in our polity as well as society, is the statement being made. I am going to make the argument, the bane of this entire problem, or let's say the root cause, is the importation of secularism altogether and the separation of the church from the state. I am making the very clear argument that the Indian state at the outset has invented an artificial separation thanks to 200 years of colonial experience, and in the process has divorced itself from thousands of years of its civilizational experience. What is the conception or the dharmic conception of the need for a state and the need for a figurehead who is supposed to be called the ruler and therefore in some sense the representative of the divine? If you believe in the concept of Rita, it has to translate at the fundamental level, at the Vyavaharik level, to the concept of social order. And therefore, you need someone who is responsible for the preservation of the social order. And that duty falls upon the Kshatriya Varna or the Kshatriya Varna. In that sense, perhaps there are several instances in Ramayana where Rama is seen as the enforcer of the dharmic social order through the instrumentality of the state. His governance is not seen, or it is not judged purely on the aspect of, let's say, on the metric of happiness. There is no happiness index on the basis of which this is being judged. His governance is judged on adherence to dharma, whatever the consequences may be. And the assumption being that the consequences will be good as a consequence of adherence to dharma and as a consequence of commitment to dharma. Now, if this is the assumption, a constitution that does not even want to use the word dharma and shies away from using the word dharma surely cannot be the basis for the creation of a dharmic state. Because its adoption of secularism as one of its basic features pits itself against the concept of a dharmic state altogether, because it does not want to recognize the concept of dharma, because it approximates dharma to religion. And therefore, the first thing that needs to be understood from a Hindu perspective is the creation of a state is meant for treating dharma as the basis for the existence of the state and for the pursuit of dharma, artha, kama, moksha in a dharmic manner by creation of circumstances which are conducive to dharma. I'm also going to make a few statements which may which may hurt people who have a problem with the concept of jati and varna. I'm here to make certain statements which I can support. So I'm not going to bother about offended sentiments. You have chosen to come here, you have opened yourself to offense. So the problem is yours. Our fundamental belief has been that the creation of a particular social order cannot be left to anarchy altogether. You will have to combine two aspects here. It's not entirely based on design, and it's not entirely left to the devices of nature. You perhaps look at creating a design or forging a design which is consistent with principles of natural order. And one of the things that nature abhors, or certainly does not accommodate, okay, this is going to lead to controversy, but it's okay, is the principle of equality, which is the product of enlightenment. Enlightenment pushes an illusion and something that is unnatural, but which has become unfortunately politically correct. And to say anything against the established values of enlightenment leads to unnecessary ad hominem attacks. And the hypocrisy of this entire situation is, while equality is presented as the goal to be achieved, the fact remains that we have only moved from inequality to greater inequality. Anybody who believes that we are truly a democracy, or any democracy is truly a democracy, is actually living an illusion. Because at best you may have an equal right to vote, but the fact of the matter is there are interest groups, there are special interest groups, there are mercantile groups, there are power groups, there are social groups which control the equation entirely. So what has been sold to you is snake oil in the name of equality. But then are we saying that a dharmic system worships inequality? Is that the statement? Is that the converse of that statement? No. Varnashrama dharma is based on a certain conception of human psychology and human consciousness. And it cannot be understood independent of the economic realities of the time it existed in, or the professional realities of the time it existed in. Varnashrama dharma, to the best of my limited understanding, the operative word being limited, is a confluence of a belief in karma and prarabdha, marrying it with certain vocational responsibilities that are attributed to certain human tendencies, and also creating familial institutions which are based on these premises, as a consequence of which endogamous marriages evolve out of this understanding. So clearly, to understand Varnashrama Dharma, it is not possible to look at it purely from the perspective of let's say, power, or from the perspective of profession, or from the perspective of racial purity, or blood purity, or eugenic purity. None of these do justice to this equation whatsoever. You will need to look at it as a whole. Now, if this happens to be the premise, the question that you must ask yourself is, if you were to elevate this particular historical figure as the ideal, and the laws or his conduct as, let's say, something to go by, something which is worthy of emulation, knowing fully well that it is, let's say, in the context of a certain yuga, how are you then going to make the case for the transcendental nature of the lessons of that particular epic in this yuga? You can't argue that certain principles are based, are yuga specific on the one hand, and then in the same breath also make a case for transcendentalism. That's not going to happen. So perhaps you may have to look at, are you focusing on the letter, or are you focusing on the spirit behind the letter? What is the essence that you can extract and then apply? Because it is that bija, or that essence, that each of these, let's say, epics is trying to push forward. Now, I am someone who believes that perhaps in an ideal world, assuming that everybody is freed of this myth or this matrix called equality, someday people will arrive at their senses after their egos are, let's say, after their egos are pacified. And then they'll come down to terra firma and then tell themselves, maybe there is some truth to it. At a time when we don't know who is going to produce the next generation of honest teachers, what are we supposed to do? How do we create this particular class of people, a breed of people? When the Indian Armed Forces has to come out with ads after ads asking for people to apply, where do we then, or what kind of incentives do we create for people to join the armed forces when it's increasingly becoming politically incorrect to join the armed forces, thanks to our comrades from the left? And in light of what the private sector has to offer, in light of a booming private economy, in light of a booming startup economy, what are you going to offer by way of incentive for any person to join the armed forces? Unless and until you're banking entirely on somebody's natural instincts to join the armed forces. That is leaving too much to chance. That's leaving the security of an entire nation entirely to the element of chance, which cannot happen, which should not happen. Because you're banking on a probability which may or may not work in your favor. 3, let's come to the nastiest conclusion possible based on what I've said. Am I a Manuvadi who's asking for the restoration of the Varnashrama Dharma in full force? Am I batting for untouchability? Am I batting for, let's say, revocation of Articles 17 and 25(2)(b) of the Constitution? No. Certainly not. I am not batting for any of these aspects, because I am being a realist, a dharmic realist, in the sense that I want to push the dharmic agenda as openly and as clearly as possible, staying within the constitutional bounds, in the process hoping that the Constitution itself will be revisited at some point. So what do you do then? Please pay attention to this last segment, because on the basis of which I will explain my case studies of the European example and the Israeli example. Krita, Dharma, Karma, Prarabdha, Dharma. There is an element of the trigonic calculation, as I call it, which means you're trying to understand Sattva, Rajas and Tamo, asking yourself, see, the best part is it's not trying to eliminate tamas, because it accepts it as the existence. It's a reality that you have to deal with. Which is, if you know for a force that if you know for a fact that a certain force is something that you cannot push back because it's unstoppable, the only thing that you can try and do is perhaps veer it away in a slightly different direction. So assuming that tamas is something that cannot be fully eliminated, and importantly, it has a role to play in times of war. Rajas has a role to play in times of war. Sattva has a role to play to keep Rajas and Tamas in check, to prevent mercantilism and tyranny of power and the tyranny of the muscle in check. Then how do I make sure that I create a calculus which has an institutional pushback between the three? How do I do that? Now, the first thing that you have to do when you start this argument is, going back to my point of equality, accept the fact that sattva is the ideal. Once you accept the fact that sattva is the ultimate goal to veer towards or to move towards, you have accepted a hierarchy of qualities. If you accept the hierarchy of qualities, you have no other option but to accept the hierarchy of people showing those qualities. As a consequence, you will never be able to make the argument that although everyone is deserving of respect, I will never be able to make the argument that everybody is equally deserving of equal respect. I'm sorry to say that. Not something that's going to happen. It's one thing to say that some person must be respected because he too is a human being. But that's the Christian way of looking at it. We are basically saying you must respect a being, human or not. That's our position. They have learned the value of other beings after these cat videos and dog videos. We know it long before. That is an arrogant statement I'm happy to make, without a problem. Now, once you accept this hierarchy, then you say, okay, what do I do? How do I create a functional model where I also set a certain yardstick or a golden standard for everybody to work towards? And therefore, at the heart of the establishment of town planning or in the designing of the, let's say, the society itself, those who display sattva at its highest are given centrality, period. And therefore, the design of a state or a city revolves around the temple for a specific reason. It is seen as both the point of convergence as well as the instrumentality of achievement of sattva. Now, if that is the case, if you were to treat that as the gold standard, you also have to accept that some will aspire for it and some will admire it from a distance but not aspire for it, because there are human limitations. Nevertheless, what is to be preserved is not the fear of sattva, which is the Marxist way of looking at the creation of the Brahmin as a post, where he sees this as a power equation of oppression. But it is to be seen as an aspirational model. And the only person who, according to me, who has led a non-Brahmin movement and who has understood this beautifully well, sorry, it's not Dr. Ambedkar, certainly not E.V. Ramaswamy Urf Periyar, it is Narayana Guru, who has actually understood it much better. Where he says, indulge in comparative Hinduism, where you treat this as the gold standard to move towards. Don't pull someone down, try to go up, is the argument that he makes. Now, if that is the language that is used by Sri Narayana Guru, citing him as the icon, I would say Narayana Guru accepts that there exists someone who is up and someone who is down. It's not my statement. Now, going from that, what do you do next? So those on whom is cast the highest burden of preservation of sattva will have the highest rigors of personal and social behavior visited upon them. From Nitya Karma Anushtanas to the enforced, not poverty, but certainly not abundance of Lakshmi. In the hope that those who have Saraswati in their hands, or at least who receive the blessing of Saraswati from her hands, will have to be slave to Lakshmi through others. So that you ensure that there is no arrogation of all forms of power in one community or one individual. I'm sure there are students of law here, and therefore please read up the definition of abuse of dominance and dominance under the Competition Act. Competition Act is preventing arrogation of the ability in the hands of one group or one entity, or what they call a single economic entity, to the extent that it has the power to change market forces single-handedly but can never be affected by any market force. That is the definition of dominance under antitrust laws or Competition Act, which is to say, someone is so powerful in a room that his movement is bound to affect everybody else, but nobody else's movement will affect that person. That arrogation of power in whatever form, either in the form of knowledge or in the form of money or in the form of muscle, should be avoided. So it is not division of labor. Anybody who makes that argument for, let's say, the Chaturvarna Ashrama really doesn't understand it. It is to prevent arrogation of power. Division of labor is merely a consequence of the primary intent of preventing arrogation of power. So you have very clear Nitya Karma, let's say, or let's say, more than Nitya Karma, what is it that you're supposed to follow if you're following a certain vocation? These principles are being observed. Now, clearly, you're looking at a structure. So let me also make the additional point. And therefore, V4 to V3 to V2 to V1, everyone is expected to understand this. And V1 also must understand, protect the Veda as much as you want, but your next meal is dependent on everybody else. Period. Operate with that sense of realistic humility. So there is a certain element of balancing of egos also. Should you choose to do this, what you effectively create is a structure which is designed to protect the core. And that Bija Raksha is what this entire structure is designed for. That Bija Raksha can be treated as knowledge, or it can be treated as a spiritual inheritance. And if you are a believer of how all-pervading the Veda is, then you have to treat Veda as the most fundamental basic science from which comes all applied sciences. That is one way of looking at it. Which is to say, there is no art form, there is no form of pursuit of knowledge which can be completely divorced from the Veda, is the belief of Vedic practitioners at the very least. And I happen to be someone who believes in it, even though I am not anywhere close to the pay grade of those practitioners. As a beginner, I subscribe to it, and that's precisely why I'm looking forward to being trained in it. Now, whether my prarabdha actually allows for it, that is for the gods to decide. Now, when you have this structure, the question that you will then ask yourself is, fine, it made sense at a certain point of time. If according to you, this structure was so fantastic, why did it crumble? What were the fail-safe mechanisms that they put in place? Allow me to say this. You can either take a defeatist version of history, or you can ask yourself if there is a certain continuity between something that was practiced 2,000 years ago and today. Despite these invasions and colonization, wouldn't you say that Bija Raksha has actually succeeded to a significant extent? You're only looking at the physical destruction that has been caused. But the fact that there is a knowledge code that manages to actually present itself and duplicate itself in the very way it existed several thousands of years ago is proof of the fact that it has survived. No wonder all these people want to plagiarize it in the name of calling it Kutanulu when it comes to Bharatnatyam or whatnot. So if I were to look at it objectively, the core purpose of the existence of the system and its foolproof mechanisms have been tested in a very withering and rigorous manner as possible through these multiple waves of barbaric invasion and sly proselytizing colonization. And still it has survived. So the system has seen a marauding tiger, it has also seen a slithering snake, and it has survived. And the test cannot be on an absolute basis when you look at, let's say, the rest of the civilizations that don't exist around you anymore. None of the civilizations existed, and here I will specifically credit Sri Pankaj Saxena for pointing this out brilliantly, wherein he said, I think almost every civilization has managed to create its own versions of V2, V3, and V4 out of practical necessity, which is the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra. But the genius of the Hindu civilization lies in creating the knowledge core through the creation of the Brahminical position. And that is what has actually ensured two things: continuing Hindu consciousness, two, continuing civilizational continuity across the country. Otherwise, you're actually looking at a situation where people are looking at propping sub-identities at the expense of the dharmic civilizational identity by killing the Sanskritic identity and giving all other sub-identities precedence over the Sanskritic identity. That is the game of the Dravidianist hooligan and thug. And his communist comrades have also entered the Telugu scene, so beware. He's entered the pop culture, he's entered the movie space, and Shyam Singh Roy is an example of that. And he is now moving in the direction of the Kannada industry, because Kerala is already in their hands. But despite that, there is a resistance that's coming through the Kerala movie industry now, which is fantastic. Now, why is this important? The Bija Raksha, or let's say the core, not only preserves the actual core, it also creates second order effects in terms of transmitting that consciousness, if not knowledge, to everybody else. Which is to say, you may not have the adhikara to actually practice this, but I am doing this for Loka Kalyan, not for my Kalyan, and therefore you're an equal stakeholder in the protection of the system. That is the second order effect that it creates. Now, from there you come to, so this according to me is the reason for the existence of the system. The next question therefore you should ask, and here we move to the case studies. I'll finish this in 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Which is, how does this particular model sit well with contemporary realities? What do you do? Especially when you're looking at the looming presence of modernity in private as well as in social lives. The looming presence of modernity through the instrumentality of the state, which constantly sees Hindu institutions as the objects of perpetual reform, and which makes it its part-time business to constantly interfere with the institution, because it has now made the Brahmin the villain. A specific designation or a post that was created as an aspirational model has become a hate figure across the board. From the communist to the Khalistani, the Brahmin is the snake who needs to be killed, and the Dravidianist is waiting first in the line. I couldn't have made any of these points in an academic sense without telling you that these are the practical implications of, let's say, diluting that core. Allow me to also tell you something else, which is, if you treat this as a knowledge tradition, what I think the genius of the civilization is in, to say, there will be certain institutions where this particular Varna or Kula will have certain primacy, and there will be certain other institutions where it will not have that primacy. And in those institutions, even if you're a Varna by Brahmin or Jati, it doesn't make a difference. You are second in line to the person who is meant to occupy that post, which is exactly why you have institutions where the Brahmin is not the priest. And it's not an exception. It is a norm in certain places, and it is certainly enough as an example to show that this too exists. It's not minuscule, it's not negligible, it is not something that can be summarily and cursorily dismissed. Now, when this happens, since Hindu Protestantism, which is the product of its interaction with Protestant Reformation-driven European colonization, the Hindu mind is looking for the equivalent of the Catholic priest in its own society when none has existed so far. So therefore, all the evils, the debauchery, the corruption, and everything that is associated with the Catholic Church is imposed and foisted and projected onto the Hindu core, and then the elimination starts. That is the current process. That's exactly what we have been witnessing since 1857. 1857 for a specific reason, Because the British man realized that the only way to prevent a similar mutiny is by killing the Hindu caste structure. And that's exactly what they started by introducing employment qualifications, which effectively said it's open to everyone. If I say this now, you'll say, are you saying that only Brahmins had to go? I might even make the argument that Brahmins shouldn't have opted for those positions in the first place. I'd have said that. But the problem is, since you have taken away his ability to survive and he has to eat, he has to go to a place where he gets food and employment, and therefore he chooses to learn English. I am not absolving the Brahmin of learning the English and abandoning his roots. Please don't take that. I'm saying these were compulsions. So is this a Brahmin making a case for Brahminism? No, it's not. But there can't be a discussion on Dharma and Veda Dharma and Ramayana without talking about Brahmins. Let me be clear about that. And I don't suffer from any politically correct filter for me to hold back my punches on this point. Because this is the object of attack, this is the institution under attack. And once this particular institution is done away with, the hope is that it would have completely loosened the second order effects, making it possible to harvest souls. The atmosphere has become positively hazy. Reflects our current societal vision. So, no, not because of Dhupa or Deepa, because the fakir is blowing it everywhere. So the next question would be, how do you deal with this situation? Now let me give you an example from a European perspective as to how they were they single-handedly killed their own culture. And the blame for the downfall of the civilization, of the European civilization, is not just the demographic decline, but is actually the Protestant Reformation, which is playing its consequences out after 500 years. So the Protestant Reformation does two things which are seriously problematic. From a Christian perspective, I don't have a problem. Let Europe be de-Christianized. I don't have an issue. I'm just telling you what lessons you have to draw from it. And let's see if you're able to draw parallels between what happened then and what's happening now, or what's been happening for the last 150 to 200 years. They said, pedophile, corrupt, uses the church for all sorts of activities, oppressive. Marxism is not a deviation from Enlightenment or Protestant Reformation. It is a product of it. It has the same Abrahamic template. You're with us or against us is the language of the Marxist as much as it is of the Abrahamic faith system. It's not a mere coincidence. Now when they do that and they say, look, do away with Christian rituals, do away with these Latin rituals. What is the importance of Latin in Christianity? Why are we actually clinging on to it? You should be able to, let's say, speak or perform Christian liturgy in other languages. The centrality of Latin must be killed. Focus more on spirituality, kill away or do away with rituals. Because you see, spirituality is everything. Rituals play no role whatsoever in spirituality. And historical or not, Jesus' attack on the rabbis is used as an example to basically attack rituals, to say he focused more on the essence as opposed to the rituals and the institution. Therefore, that becomes the basis. Third, democratize religion and take away the power of religious elites fully. And therefore, you don't need a specific church or a place for convergence. And that takes away the power of congregational prayer, it takes away the power of sense of community, and that starts a certain ball rolling, which has now come to a point where European Christian churches are now museums or are becoming mosques. We are not in the race yet, we should be. Africa and Europe, according to me, is up for grabs. We should be jumping into the picture. Now, once you start doing this, you're looking at a hollowed out European civilization that doesn't know how to respond to the rising religion, the fastest rising religion in Europe. Its brother from Middle East. It has no clue how to deal with it. Because the Ashraf Corps has preserved its position, And the insistence on the Sharia is as militant as it gets. Much more than you can imagine. No truly Manuvadi princely state even did that. If at all there was a truly Manuvadi state ever. Because the difference is Sharia expects compliance, Shastras provide guidance. And so Europe is wondering, what do I do with this? And it's looking at the most superficial solutions possible. Demography, have more children. Idiots producing 3 idiots is certainly not the solution, no? You're only compounding the problem. You're only compounding the problem. If you're utterly deracinated and you don't have a sense of reconstructing your identity as a civilization or as a faith, what are you exactly hoping to bequeath to the next generation by way of a legacy? Nothing. Shunya will give you only Shunya. What are you going to deliver from that? So am I the Hindu Mujahideen, as some people accuse me of? No. We have better words. Please don't use Mujahideen. I'm okay with the role, not with the label. So what do? Europe has 2 options. Learn from Eastern Europe and fall back on the only bulwark of Christian civilization today, which is better than Western churches, is the Orthodox Eastern Church, which is what Poland and Russia stand for. And that reflects even in their immigration policies. I'll bring all of this back to Ramayana, you wait. So they are looking at solutions. But I think there couldn't have been a more celebratory time period for my brothers from the Middle East. Because Eastern Orthodox Church and the states which keep it up are fighting the West. And the possibility of Christendom is being destroyed as we see. Or the resurrection of Christendom is being destroyed. Unless Eastern Christianity prevails. And if you look at all the YouTube comments that are glorifying Putin from United States, something is happening in United States without any intervention through Google or anybody else. Americans are stupid if they think that Russians actually need to intervene in their elections. Socially, they are so leaderless and rudderless and rootless that they're looking for leader-like figures anywhere they can get. Our Modi ji being no exception to it. Now, that is the European example. Now, let's come to the example that Hindus constantly cite. Oh, my Jewish brother, I wish I were like you. Oh, Israel, I wish India were like Israel. Okay, let's see how Israel has fared. Starts off as an avowedly Jewish state on 14th of May, 1948. Our myopia is that we focus only on that. We don't focus on what happened and what is happening subsequently. Because we keep saying, he has done something that I should have done in 1947. So here's the interesting aspect of the Israeli society now. I've given this example before. It has an ultra-Orthodox core, which perhaps comes closest, not theologically, from a structural perspective to the practicing Vaidika Brahmin. And the socio-economic indicators of the practicing Vaidika Brahmin and the ultra-Orthodox Jews are almost the same. They live in poverty, enforced poverty. The men are expected to pursue the Veda, and the women are expected to pursue Lakshmi for survival. And the Veda says have at least 10 children. The ultra-Orthodox community pushes it because at least it's not surrounded by people who hate them fully. Here, if you happen to be a practicing Brahmin in Madras, you never know when your Shikha or your Janu will be cut off. If you sport it openly on a bike, when you're going from one place to another. It's come to that. It is coming to that. Don't be surprised. It is coming to that. Now, the strength of Israel is the open declaration of its religious identity at the outset. But the declaration of the religious identity was done by Zionist nationalists who had nothing but anathema for ultra-Orthodox Jews, because they believed that the weakness of the ultra-Orthodox Jew is single-handedly responsible for the itinerant history of the Jewish community, because they did not have the Kshatriya spirit to stand up and fight back. So the ultra-Orthodox Jew is the object of hatred, disgust, derision, and contempt for the nationalist Zionist Jew, who is a Jew only on paper, but not in practice. Reminds you of an ideology here? Think about it. Now, what has happened is, a social contract is evolved between the ultra-Orthodox Jews and the rest of the Israeli state, where they are told, allow us to run our yeshivas, allow us to practice the reading of the Talmud, the Torah, allow us to keep this tradition alive, because this is what we have been commanded to do so. We have a covenant, a sacred covenant, which we can't run away from. A servant has the option of resignation. A slave does not have the option of resignation. We are slaves to the covenant. We are not servants to the covenant. Similar to the role of Padmanabhadasa from Travancore, the royal family of Travancore. Now, when they make this statement, they also say we are not allowed to pick up arms. That is something that we cannot. Even our Apat Dharma does not allow for it. And therefore, we will not contribute our children to the mandatory military conscription as a policy that the state of Israel subscribes to. That led to massive social tensions. Saying, we are all contributing our children, our money, tax and everything. What are you doing? That's where Israel's founding as a Jewish state which has no belief in the core of Judaism comes to the fore, because it doesn't realize that they're reading the Torah and the yeshiva not because they can't pursue other professional spheres, but because they believe this is good for the followers of that particular deity. Which is to say, no one who is supposed to be doing all the yajnas or homas is doing it for himself. He is doing it for the benefit of the rest of us. And not just for Hindus, by the way. It is always meant for Loka Kalyan. And therefore, you are not going to be, you can't be mercantile in your question to them. What is the return on my investment in your community? Well, it is all intangible. It is social. The dividend is social in nature. Then the ultra-Orthodox community was forced to participate with accommodations for their prayer regime as part of the military regiments which were created. They were perhaps the only, I could be wrong, I'm not an expert on their politics entirely. I'm an avid reader of it, that's it. They were allowed to sport the thread that they're supposed to sport as part of their military attire. So while the howitzers are blazing, they're given an opportunity to pray while all of this is happening. They have to do all of that. But the problem is, the current state of Israel is producing heavily Christianized and secular Jews who see themselves as cultural Jews but not as religious Jews. That is the problem with Hindutva being presented as cultural nationalism with no Hindu component in it. As long as Hindutva reduces itself entirely to, let's say, a protective shell which wants to finish the core or enjoys a, let's say, love-hate relationship with the core, it will become an empty shell because it is a fort which does not know what it is meant to protect. If it is meant to be a shield or a sword, there must be an object of protection. What is that object of protection? Just people? No. People practicing a certain way of life. That is the way you complete the sentence. So what is the option from there in light of these histories, and what is the way forward perhaps for us? Very tentative solutions and suggestions. Varnashrama Dharma perhaps has only relevance on caste certificates and reservations and marriages at best today, because I don't think anybody is following their Jati Dharma. Very few are. The only spaces where Jati Dharma are actually practiced are religious spaces, because that is a non-negotiable. The problem with the Indian state is whether the Congress is in power or anybody else is in power. All the reformative tendencies and reformist tendencies are always directed at this particular institution to replace that core and replace the guardians of that core. When you do that, at least don't push the lie that you're striving for the establishment of Ramarajya. That would be completely at loggerheads with establishment of Ramarajya. Because that means you have reduced this great historical figure who has been elevated to the status of Godhead to a mere political tool, not just for rallying the community together, but also to be used as political tokenage. And that equally reflects in populating the board of that particular institution today with political appointees, which should have never been the case. So for those who accuse me of being the stooge of a particular party, here's my answer to you. What is wrong when it comes to the population of a dharmic institution is wrong regardless of who does it. Whether the Congress does it or the BJP does it, makes no difference. Temple boards cannot become playgrounds for politics and politicians. If I'm allowed to make this statement in the context of the DMK in Tamil Nadu and I get cheers and claps from people of a certain party, they should not go mum when I make this statement in the context of Karnataka or any other state. Because that would be pursuit of a religio-civilizational dream or vision, as opposed to an organizational goal. Questions, please. So just to round it off, I am batting for the protection of the core, and I'm saying be as secular and as avarna as you want outside of it. But the presence of that particular core in its purest form is a condition precedent if dharma has to survive. If not, it will go the Israel way in the best case, and in the worst case possible, it will go the European way. Sorry? No, I'm not choosing. You choose that. It will seem as if I planted people to ask questions. It's as random as it gets, okay? I have no role. I don't know who these people are from Adam or Manu. Yeah.
Yeah, the first question there, please.
Hello. Okay. Thank you for your always enlightening speech, sir. So I have two statements to make for both of those.
Sorry, just it has to be questions, no statements.
Oh, right, okay. So you made a point about Constitution having to recognize the inherent dharma if we are pushing for it.
Right.
And it would have to fall back on the Shastras for it to understand what dharma is. And Shastras overwhelmingly, they promote monarchy. So is that something you think that Constitution would have to recognize monarchy? Or if dharma has to refactor itself and project itself on the currently existing democracy, who takes the charge of that refactor, the lawyers or the acharyas? Thank you.
So first thing is the belief that Dharma has prescribed monarchy may be dislodged by the example of the Vrishnis, who existed as a confederacy, not exactly as a monarchy. Okay? So I don't think it's a question of that. I'd rather go with a slightly different approach to it. Since 2014, ours has morphed into a presidential form of election one way or the other, where you're voting for an individual more than a party. Right? There are times that there are several people who may not vote for the party had it not been for the same figure standing at the top. And precisely because the other side has absolutely no options to offer. Right? And each of those options are malicious, diabolical, anti-dharmic, and therefore anti-Bharat. Now, therefore, I don't think fixation on on monarchy is something that has to do with it. It is possible to look at structural systems. Here is where I will find a square inch area of meeting ground with someone who I don't believe are dharmics, the Charvakas. I don't think of them as dharmics at all. They have no role. they are not to be treated as dharmics, and they cannot have a say whatsoever when it comes to the course of dharma or the treatment of dharmic institutions, much less on what needs to be treated as reform for dharmic institutions. The Charvaka does not believe in moksha, and therefore he cannot speak of an institution that puts faith in moksha. He is an existentialist. He comes as close as possible to a Hindu Marxist. He is not to be discussed. And he is not to be heard in this equation. The only thing that I'm interested in asking is, if the essence is this, in protection of the core, what structure can I come out with in the current day which propagates, advances the cause of the protection of the core? And assuming that the Constitution or the concept of a constitution, and therefore constitutionalism is here to stay, then how do I use this document to further that particular goal? And in that sense, can we look at more options where one of the requirements for appointment to an elected position or a constitutional position is the subscription to the concept of dharma as a form of the oath itself? Then I'm looking at people who will have no other option but to swear allegiance by dharma. And I again repeat, dharma is not religion. Okay? I will simply call it as the onto-politico-socio-theological experience of this land. That's how I would want to loosely define it. I am no authority, I am no expert. The second part of your question, lawyers give too much credit to themselves. No wonder the judiciary asserts independence over all other forms of organs, right? I would rather go with a situation where I seek the guidance of dharmic scholars who understand dharmic statecraft and then serve or use lawyers as bridges to get the job done from a contemporary perspective without using the word modernity or modern perspective. The need of the hour is someone like me who is interested in achieving that end has no dharmic training, and someone who has dharmic training has no way of making himself, let's say, heard or relatable to a modern statecraft audience or a contemporary statecraft audience. Therefore, where is the bridge that effectively gulfs, or let's say that builds, or gulfs this chasm, that closes this chasm and says, okay, this is how you talk to each other. The handshake is in spurts, because half the time I'm trying to look for English translatables for Sanskrit terms, which will never be complete. And in fact, the number of papers that I've seen where they try and wrap their heads around the word dharma in English itself is proof of the fact that there are multiple untranslatables to put it in the words of a person who I don't get along with, who has written a book on untranslatables, right? Now, therefore, we start with bridge scholarship in the hope that more and more lawyers will feel the need, and especially constitutional lawyers, feel the need to draw from our own sources when they speak of constitutionalism. That is something that is sorely missing today. Anybody who does that, who attempts to do that, is branded as a saffron brigand, unfortunately. So, I would want to consult the acharyas. But there is also an important aspect here that unfortunately today, certain realities of how the state operates, and you're also looking at international considerations because Bharat is not an island, either geographically or otherwise. Those realities may not be entirely relatable to someone who's practicing only the Anushtana. One of the reasons is our own religious institutions have stopped being societal institutions from the perspective of politics, because they're constantly being told, you step into politics, I'll take away your land. I'll start pressing charges against you. I'll prop someone who effectively calls the legitimacy of your position in question, who will say that this pontiff should not have been appointed in the first place, he is a usurper to the post. So the state creates all sorts of foisted litigation to shut up only our people. But when it comes to others, they don't do that. There is a fetter that's been imposed on the state which has had the effect of a chilling effect on the free speech of our acharyas. So of all the so-called people, let's say of all the people who pursue their faith systems, it's only the Hindu acharyas who are most reticent when it comes to making their voices heard on political issues or societal issues because of the treatment that the Hindu state gives to them or the Indian state gives to them. So there are people on Twitter who say, why don't our gurus speak up on this? Are you serious? Do you know how the state actually threatens them? And no state is an exception to that. They're literally held hostage to their own mathas. Only in the last few years, they've managed to speak up gradually. So one of the, let's say, condition precedents to arrive at what you're asking for is greater participation of temples and mathas openly in political discussions and social discussions, because that is not barred under the Constitution. If politics has an impact on societal institutions and religious institutions, can you expect them not to have a voice in that particular process? Impossible. Next.
Next question. There. The lady there.
Hello. Good evening, sir.
Namaste.
Namaste. Jai Sri Rama.
Jai Sri Ram.
I'm a person who believes that we have to uphold the Vedas if we want to, sustain the current scenarios and to uphold the Sanatana Dharma. But my question is, in the current scenario, where we do not indulge in the Varna profession from which Varna we are coming in, and where I don't see any V1 group has any interest in learning Vedas, should that be open to learning Vedas?
Very
should
good
it
question.
be opening to everybody
Very good
who's
question.
interested, or it should be only hereditary?
Okay.
And also extending this question to intercaste marriage, where we
Right.
talk about Pitru Devatas and
Right.
their alignment, everything. This is my question.
Right.
I'm a person who completely believe that we need to withhold Vedas.
Right, right.
And we have to uphold Gayatri Mantra that
Understood.
protects the Vedas.
Understood.
Yes. Yeah. This is my question, sir.
So the interesting part is, at least since the explosion of the internet and information on the internet, I haven't seen anybody stopping anybody from learning the Vedas. And still it so happens that only a particular group seems to be showing interest in learning the Vedas, without any social incentive, economic incentive. In fact, there is a greater social disincentive to learning the Vedas openly. Right? So this false narrative needs to be busted. There are certain people sitting on Twitter who call themselves coming from the Hindu right and who subscribe to these kind of false notions. Effectively, on these topics, they are no different from the left and the Marxists. Both of them say the very same thing. Conveniently, each of them has their own justifications for coming after the Brahmin. I would say at least I will respect the leftists in that particular sense, because I know he's an open enemy. These are people sitting inside within the camp and still constantly bash Brahmins. These are the people who must be gone after first. I'm saying this bluntly, whoever they may be. Second, one of the things about our way of life is, assume for a moment that V2, V3, and V4 were to start the pursuit of the Veda. Are you really telling me that the Brahmin today has the political muscle or other muscle to stop them from doing so? No. No, they don't. At least hereditary Brahmins don't. Vaidika Brahmins are a micro minority. They don't, right? The argument to be made when it comes to this, and this is exactly what is different from us, let's say, between us and others, is that we say, you disagree with a particular system. Don't change that institution, you set up a parallel universe. Okay? Arya Samaj, for all practical purposes, says, does, and believes a lot of things which, let's say, Vaidika Brahmins may or may not agree with. I'm not passing a value judgment, I'm giving a statement of fact, right? Now, what do you ultimately leave it to? If you're able to find traction, and if you can convince people that you're the right way, go ahead, do it. You don't change me, you don't change my institution. So someone wants to do this, I'd say go set up temples which are non-agamic in that particular sense. But those temples which are based on Shastras and Agamas cannot be interfered with, because you cannot interfere with the Agama under any circumstances. I will not stop the construction of non-agamic institutions and temples because there are Arya Samaj mandirs which do not subscribe to Agamas. You come to Punjab, you come to Delhi, there are, in fact, most weddings are Arya Samaji weddings, for God's sakes. Abhishek Bachchan married Aishwarya Rai in an Arya Samaji wedding. I wasn't invited, I know. But I'm telling you this. Now, who is stopping them? Do you know that these days Arya Samaji weddings are being officiated by female priestesses wearing the Janevu? Is anybody going after them and stopping them? Nobody is doing that. Because as I said, Sharia demands compliance. We basically say, this is what I recommend. You want to do. If you don't, ni karma ante. Right? If there is meant to be a consequence for what you have done, it will have. I am nobody to interfere with it. I am only saying, don't bring your reformist nonsense into my institution and ask me to divorce my allegiance to the Agama. That's all I'm asking for. Right? Now, frankly, after having interacted with the Vaidika community in several parts of the country, I am not hopeless. I have nothing but admiration for the circumstances and the conditions that they work in. Unbelievable. Someone I know very closely, 2 generations ago, were in secular professions under the guidance and instructions of Mahapariva Sri Chandrasekhara Saraswati. They gave up the secular professions altogether. And they said, all of us will pursue the pursuit of Veda. We'll run a Goshala. We will educate ourselves in this so-called modern English education through open universities, so that the better part of our time is spent in mastering the Vedas. And I said this on a podcast recently. 8-year-old was teaching a 10-year-old, a 10-year-old was teaching a 13-year-old, a 13-year-old was being taught by a 15-year-old. This is how the hierarchy works there. And you know what they do? Despite the meager income that they make, they know that they'll need at least one person to carry this tradition forward. And therefore, they actually have a better TFR than educated Hindus, or let's say secularized English educated Hindus. Because it is under their compulsion and their commitment to keeping the tradition alive that they say we need at least 2 or at least 3, and we need to make sure that this goes forward under any circumstances. This is how they operate. And families of 10 and 12 survive on a regular income of 1 person. This cunning evil snake can pursue greener pastures in California. Why is he here? Which of these V2, V3 and V4 are coming and saying, we will support you, go ahead, do this? Why? Even the anglicized Mylapore based V1, who is helping them? They are doing it on their own. Because they are living out the Gita in action. This is what I am expected to do, I will do, independent of success or failure, period. Next.
Yeah, Sri
Last question.
Yeah, last question. Sri Ram Kari in front from the Deccan Chronicle.
Namaste.
Namaste, Sai Deepak. You sound better in person than on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Do I look better or not?
I wanted to understand
Yes.
within the recesses of your mind, how does Sanatan Dharma and Bharat link in the sense, if you had to save one, sacrificing the other, would you save the Sanatan Dharma and sacrifice Bharat? Or would you save Bharat or India and sacrifice the Dharma?
It's a beautiful question, and I'll relate it to my own personal experience, and I'll connect it to the works of Radha Kumud Mukherjee and Majumdar in a slightly different sense. You have to read them for their understanding of the importance of geography. So let me explain this. So when you start practicing your Nitya Karma, and if you happen to be someone who is traveling on a regular basis, you're not going to be provided the best of circumstances to follow it to the T always. So the rule is 100% when you're at home, 75% at your relative's place, 50% at a friend's place, and 25% in enemy territory. More or less, that seems to be the equation. That means home is where you get to practice dharma 100%. Particularly when you happen to be a literally rooted faith. Its teachings are universal. Please don't discount it. I am not taking away the universalism of our teachings. But it certainly has a lodestone, a mothership, an epicenter, namely Bharat. Okay. Now the question that you're asking me to answer is an eventuality, which is if Hindus were to face the same situation as the Jews during the Roman period and we were forced to exile and we were forced to run away, or the closer home experience of the Kashmiri Pandits from Kashmir, what do you do then? Well, although it's a huge loss, because this is the bhumi that is associated with all your itihasas and puranas, and therefore all the consecrated spaces, the Shaktipithas, the Jyotirlingas and whatnot, the gatekeepers, namely Badri and Travancore of our borders, what do you do then? It is Sanatana Dharma, it will still have to find a way to exist. And no wonder it is finding, let's say, people who are embracing it in Russia and other places. That is perhaps proof of the fact that, yes, this too is possible. But am I going to therefore use that as an example to say that this is the default position? In logic, you never use an extreme situation to judge the validity of a proposition in the median. It makes really no sense. Because the logic of peacetime is different from the logic of wartime. It can't be the same. Right? If it comes to that, and if that unfortunate eventuality ever happens, my answer would be dharma is your only remaining psychological connect to Bharata, and therefore hold on to dharma. And that's exactly what the NRIs do when they go there. They try to recreate it as much as possible. They're not just recreating a mental faith. They're trying to recreate the ambience. They're trying to recreate the space itself. And that is why Radha Kumud Mukherjee and R.C. Majumdar insist on the importance of a geography as a karma bhumi to fulfill your dharma. And they also use this as the basis to say that's why the concept of a Bharata has always existed well before the British man set foot, because we have treated this as the place to work out our dharma. I genuinely hope that the energy that you have just cast out in the universe dissipates without a trace. I'm grateful. Thank you so very much for the patient hearing.